Picture this. You're driving through the Irish countryside, and the road is smooth, until it suddenly bends for no obvious reason. No house. No boulder. No river. Just a single tree standing alone in a field like it owns the place. And here's the part that makes people stare at the map and whisper, the road didn't bend because engineers couldn't straighten it. It bent because people refused to cut down that tree. In Ireland, there are trees that locals will not touch. Not for a new driveway. Not for a bigger farm gate. Not for a brand new road that could save money and time. These are often called fairy trees. And whether you believe in fairies or not, the real history behind these trees is far older, deeper, and more human than most people realize. Because when you hear fairy tree, you might picture a tourist legend, a cute little story. But in Ireland, these trees sit at the intersection of ancient landscape, pre-Christian belief, medieval storytelling, and a kind of unofficial law that shaped how communities behaved for centuries. So what is a fairy tree? Why is it often a hawthorn? What does it have to do with ringforts and old boundaries? And why, even in modern Ireland, do some people still hesitate before cutting one down? Let's go there. First, the phrase, fairy tree, usually doesn't mean a magical species that glows at night. Most of the time, it means a lone hawthorn tree, standing by itself in a field, often near a ringfort, an old earthen mound, or a place that locals already consider different. Sometimes it's an ash or a blackthorn, but the hawthorn is the one you hear about most. Especially if it stands alone. Not part of a hedge. Not one of many. Just one. And that, alone, part matters. Because in Irish tradition, a lone hawthorn can be seen as a marker. A signpost that says, this place has rules. Not written rules. Not rules you can find in a courthouse. But rules you feel in your bones because everyone around you has always treated that spot with caution. In older Ireland, places weren't just coordinates on a map. They were layered. You could stand in a field and know it as farmland, but also as a boundary, and also as a memory, and also as a place where something happened once, something your grandparents heard about, and their grandparents heard about, and on until it wasn't clear where the story began. That kind of landscape produces beliefs that don't sound logical in modern terms, but they're extremely practical when you understand the world they came from. Because for most of Irish history, people lived close to the land. Close to weather. Close to animals. Close to hunger and sickness and uncertainty. And in that kind of life, you learn something quickly, you don't mess with things you don't fully understand. So the fairy tree becomes a cultural stop sign. A warning that says, think twice. But why a hawthorn? To understand that, you have to understand how certain trees became symbolically charged. Hawthorn blooms in late spring, right around the time of old seasonal customs, especially May traditions. In many Irish and Celtic-influenced areas, May was not just spring. It was a turning point. A threshold. And threshold thinking is the secret key to fairy lore. In Irish tradition, there are thin places, moments and locations where the boundary between worlds is believed to be weaker. A doorway. A crossing. A liminal zone. Think of dusk and dawn. Think of crossroads. Think of ruins. Think of old forts. Think of lone trees. The hawthorn, especially when it stands alone, fits perfectly into this threshold logic. It becomes a natural symbol of the edge between ordinary life and something else. And that something else is often described as the good people, a cautious name for fairies, because you don't want to insult them by speaking too boldly. Now, if you're listening and thinking, okay, but this is just superstition, stay with me. Because even if you don't accept the supernatural part, the belief itself did real work in Irish society. It protected places. Ireland is covered with ancient sites, ringforts, stone circles, holy wells, burial mounds, old roads, field boundaries that can be older than some nations. Not all of these were understood as archaeological sites by ordinary people centuries ago. But they were understood as special. And if a community has a way to mark certain places as hands-off, that's a powerful tool. It prevents casual destruction. It keeps people cautious around old earthworks. It preserves the landscape without needing a museum sign. That's why fairy trees are often connected to fairy forts. Fairy forts are commonly what people call ringforts, circular earthworks found across Ireland. These structures are real and ancient. Many date back to the early medieval period, and they're scattered everywhere. To a modern eye, they can look like a slightly raised circle in a field. To an older community, they were far more than that. They were not just old. They were other. They had rules. You didn't build on them. You didn't plow through them. You didn't take stones from them. And if you did, you invited consequences. So when a lone hawthorn stands near one of these places, it becomes like a flag planted into the ground. It announces, this is not ordinary land. This is land with memory, and possibly with power. Now let's talk about the stories, because the stories are where the fairy tree really comes alive. You'll hear a certain kind of tale again and again, in different forms. It usually goes like this. Someone decides to cut down the tree. Not because they hate tradition. But because they're practical. They need to widen a field entrance. They need to straighten a road. They need firewood. They're not thinking about folklore. But someone else warns them. A neighbor. An older relative. A local who knows the stories. Don't touch that tree. And the person laughs it off. Or they ignore it. Or they say, we're in the modern world now. Then something goes wrong. Now, that something varies. Sometimes it's a run of bad luck. A vehicle accident. A sudden illness. A business failure. A tool breaking. A cow getting sick. A family conflict. Sometimes it's just a feeling that things went wrong and never quite got back on track. And here's the thing, these stories don't have to be literally supernatural to be powerful. Because in a small community, if everyone believes that cutting a fairy tree is dangerous, and you cut it anyway, you become the person who did the dangerous thing. And if your life gets harder afterward, even for normal reasons, people connect the dots. Not because they're irrational, but because human beings are pattern-making creatures. And those patterns create social pressure. So fairy tree stories function like a behavioral fence. They discourage the community from damaging a place that the community wants preserved, for reasons that go beyond economics. There's another type of story, too. The detour story. This is the one you hear with roads, building projects, and modern times. A developer wants to clear land. A crew wants to push through. And then they come to the tree. And suddenly, plans change. Quietly. Maybe the official reason is cost. Maybe it's environmental. Maybe it's public relations. But sometimes, the real reason is simply, nobody wants to be the one responsible for cutting it. Even if the workers don't believe, they might still hesitate because of what the locals will say. Or because they've heard enough stories to think, why invite trouble? This is where folklore becomes reality. Not because the tree is magical, but because belief has consequences. Now, let's widen the lens and talk about where the fairy belief itself comes from, historically. Ireland's fairy lore is not a single religion. It's a layering of older worldviews that survived through storytelling. Before Christianity, many cultures in and around Ireland held strong beliefs about spirits of place, sacred wells, protective beings, and the power of certain landscapes. When Christianity arrived, it didn't erase everything overnight. It blended. It reshaped. It sometimes pushed older beliefs into the category of folk rather than formal religion. So older ideas about unseen beings and sacred places continued to live on in local stories. They became part of how people explained misfortune, chance, and mystery. The fairies, in many Irish tales, are not the cute winged creatures of modern cartoons. They are often portrayed as powerful, unpredictable beings with their own rules. They are associated with the city, mounds or hills where they are believed to dwell. That's why fairy forts and fairy mounds are so central. And a lone tree near a mound becomes like a boundary marker for their territory. That's why you'll hear people talk about fairy paths, too, routes the fairies are believed to travel, often between mounds. If you block a fairy path by building a house across it, or placing a wall in the wrong spot, you invite trouble. Again, whether you take that literally or not, it reflects something very human, the fear of disrupting a system you can't see. In earlier centuries, there were a lot of systems people couldn't see. Disease, infection, weather patterns, animal illness, soil exhaustion, pregnancy complications, sudden death. In that context, respecting invisible boundaries is not childish. It's a survival instinct wrapped in culture. Now, let's get specific about why a single tree carries so much weight. A tree is not a stone. You can't just pick it up and move it without effort. A lone tree stands out. It becomes a landmark. People use it to describe locations. Turn left at the Hawthorn. Meet me by the lone tree. The field beyond the fairy tree. And when a thing becomes a landmark, it becomes part of community memory. It's in the stories. It's in directions. It's in arguments. It's in love stories. It's in warnings to children. So the tree becomes more than wood. It becomes a shared reference point. Now add folklore to that, and it becomes untouchable. And here's another hidden layer: fairy trees often sit at boundaries. Old boundaries between townlands. Edges of fields. Corners where roads meet. Places where one family's land ends and another begins. Places that carry the weight of, this is mine, that is yours. In many traditional societies, boundaries are sensitive. They're where disputes happen. They're where misunderstandings flare up. So marking boundaries with a symbol that nobody wants to disturb, like a fairy tree, makes the boundary stable. Think about that. A community might not have formal fencing everywhere. It might not have precise written deeds in the way we do today. But it has memory. It has local agreement. It has landmarks. And the fairy tree becomes a kind of natural legal marker. It says, do not move this. Do not mess with it. This is where the line is. Even in modern times, you can still feel that energy around certain places. People might joke about it, but they also don't rush to challenge it. Now, let's talk about the difference between history and folklore, because that's important. If you're looking for a medieval document that says, fairy trees are real, and we must protect them, you probably won't find it that way. Folklore doesn't usually live in official paperwork. It lives in practice. But you can still see its fingerprints. You can see it in how rural communities treated ringforts. You can see it in how certain trees survived where others didn't. You can see it in patterns of avoidance and in the stories recorded by folklorists in the 19th and 20th centuries, who went out and collected local tales before they vanished. And you can see it in how older beliefs kept being retold, even as Ireland modernized. There's also a moral logic in many fairy tree stories. The person who respects the tree is often portrayed as wise, humble, in harmony with the land. The person who cuts it down is portrayed as arrogant, reckless, dismissive of local knowledge. That's not an accident. It's a cultural lesson. And that lesson is not just, believe in fairies. It's, respect what your community respects. It's, don't insult the place you live. It's, don't act like you're the first person who ever walked this field. In that sense, fairy trees carry a kind of environmental ethic long before environmentalism was a modern idea. Now, you might wonder, do people in Ireland today actually believe this? The answer is complicated, and that's what makes it interesting. Some people believe it deeply. Some people believe it softly. Some people don't believe it at all, but still wouldn't cut the tree. Because belief exists on a spectrum. And Ireland has a long tradition of holding two ideas at once, skepticism and respect. Humor and caution. Modern life and old memory. You might meet someone who laughs and says, sure, it's just a fairy tree, and then immediately adds, but I wouldn't touch it. That's the real power of living tradition. It doesn't need everyone to be a true believer. It just needs enough people to treat the rule as real. And even if the rule is only followed because of social pressure or cultural pride, the outcome is the same: the tree survives, and so does the story. Now, let's return to the road that bends. Because when you see that kind of detour, it's like a physical symbol of Ireland's relationship with its own past. Modern projects can move mountains. They can carve through rock, pour concrete, flatten hills. But a lone hawthorn can still make people pause. Not always because they fear fairies in the literal sense, but because it's a piece of identity. A sign that says, we're not just building on empty land. We're building on a landscape that remembers. And that's why fairy trees also function like unofficial heritage markers. A museum can preserve objects behind glass. But folklore preserves the land itself, out in the open, where people live. The fairy tree tells you, there is something here older than your plans. And if you zoom out even more, you start to see that fairy trees are part of a wider Irish system of sacred places, holy wells, pilgrimage routes, ancient stones, ruins, forts, and mounds. Some are explicitly Christian today. Some are older and got reinterpreted. Some sit in that gray zone where nobody is sure where the belief began, but everyone knows the rules. And those rules, whether you call them superstition or tradition, shaped the Irish countryside. They influenced where people built, where they farmed, where they buried, where they walked at night, how they talked about certain hills and valleys. That's not a small thing. It means folklore isn't just stories. It's architecture. It's geography. It's human behavior carved into the landscape. So what's the real history behind Ireland's fairy trees? It's not just that people believed in fairies. It's that people lived in a world where unseen forces, whether spiritual, natural, or social, could change everything. And over centuries, they developed cultural tools to handle that uncertainty. They created stories that protected important places. They created taboos that kept communities aligned. They preserved boundaries and ancient sites by making them morally dangerous to disturb. And they wrapped all of that in a powerful symbol you can still see today, a lone tree that nobody wants to cut. So the next time you see a hawthorn standing alone in an Irish field, don't just think fairy tale. Think of it as a signpost from the past. A marker of an older Ireland, where the land was alive with meaning, and where a community could protect a place not with laws or fences, but with a story so strong that even modern roads sometimes bend around it. And now I want to ask you something. If you were planning a project and a lone hawthorn stood in your way, what would you do? Would you cut it down because it's just a tree? Or would you leave it standing, just in case? Because some things are older than us, and not everything needs to be challenged. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Ireland's hidden traditions, subscribe for more stories like this, about fairy forts, forbidden places, ancient symbols, and the real history behind the things people still whisper about today. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever seen a fairy tree in real life, or heard a story about one in your community?